settle in, because this one doesn't let go easily. Identity theft is common. Annoying, sure, but common. Credit cards opened in someone else's name, accounts drained, social security numbers cycled through fraud rings. It happens every day. Law enforcement treats it like paperwork. Victims file reports, banks reverse charges, life goes on. But sometimes, identity theft isn't about stealing money. Sometimes, it's about stealing existence itself. And when that happens, when someone takes a name and uses it to live a second life in the shadows, the consequences don't stay on paper. They end up in a morgue. This is the case of a body that was found under a name that belonged to someone else. A victim who didn't exist in any missing persons database. A life so carefully hidden that even the people who knew the victim never knew who they really were. And at the center of it all, a single pawn shop receipt. Small, faded, easy to miss. But once you see it, once you understand what it represents, the entire case snaps into focus. My name doesn't matter here. I'm a cold case researcher. I work with journalists, investigators, and families who need answers when the system has moved on. I was brought into this case 6 months after the body was discovered, after local police had hit every dead end they could find, and the file was about to go cold for good. What I'm about to walk you through isn't speculation. It's documentation. Interviews, records, timelines, and one very specific object that kept appearing in places it shouldn't have been. Let me start with the body. It was discovered on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. A maintenance worker at a mid-sized storage facility on the edge of town opened Unit 237 after the renter had missed 3 months of payments. Standard procedure. The facility sends notices, makes calls, and eventually cuts the lock and auctions off the contents to cover the debt. The worker rolled up the door, expecting furniture, boxes, maybe some tools. Instead, he found a rolled carpet in the back corner, duct taped at both ends, leaking fluid onto the concrete. He didn't open it. He called police. The body inside had been there for months. Decomposition was advanced, but not total. The medical examiner was able to recover enough for identification, dental records, partial prints, and a driver's license tucked into the victim's pocket. The license gave a name. Let's call him Aaron Fletcher. Aaron Fletcher was 38 years old, according to the ID. Brown hair, brown eyes, average build. The photo matched the facial reconstruction well enough that investigators ran it through the system. And that's where everything fractured. Aaron Fletcher, the real Aaron Fletcher, was alive, living 2 states over, working a steady job in logistics, married with a kid. He had no idea his identity had been stolen. He'd never reported suspicious activity. His credit was fine. His taxes were filed on time. Nothing was missing. But someone had been using his name for years, living as Aaron Fletcher in a completely separate life, renting apartments, opening bank accounts, even holding down employment under that stolen identity. And now that someone was dead, the question wasn't just who killed him. The question was, who was he really? The first major clue came from the victim's wallet. Tucked behind the fake driver's license was a receipt from a pawn shop about 30 miles away. The item pawned was listed as a men's wristwatch. The date on the receipt was 4 years old. The receipt had been folded and refolded so many times the creases were nearly torn through. Someone had kept it. Not in a drawer, not in a file, in their wallet. Close. Important. I made that pawn shop my first stop. The place was exactly what you'd expect. Narrow aisles, dusty glass cases, fluorescent lighting that made everything look sickly. The owner was in his 60s, balding, skeptical. He didn't remember the transaction. 4 years was a long time. But he pulled the logbook anyway. The entry was there. A man matching the victim's description had pawned a silver wristwatch with an engraved back plate. The watch had been redeemed 2 weeks later, paid in full, cash. No further record. I asked if he still had any documentation, security footage, a photocopy of ID, anything. He shook his head. Footage only kept for 90 days, he said. IDs weren't always copied back then, especially for small transactions. But he did remember one thing. The man had seemed nervous, kept looking at the door, paid fast, and left faster. I asked about the engraving on the watch. The owner squinted at his notes. 3 initials. Not AF. Not Aaron Fletcher. The initials were JRM. That discrepancy became the spine of the investigation. If the victim wasn't Aaron Fletcher, then who was JRM? And why was he living under someone else's name? I started pulling records. The fake Aaron Fletcher had been active for at least 6 years before his death. He'd rented 3 apartments in that time, all short-term leases, all paid in cash or money order. No credit cards, no loans, no digital footprint beyond the basics. He worked sporadically, mostly manual labor, under-the-table gigs, a few months here and there at warehouses or landscaping companies. Nothing that required deep background checks. He was careful, methodical. This wasn't someone who stumbled into identity theft. This was someone who needed to disappear and knew how to do it correctly. But careful people make mistakes, and this man made one. He got too comfortable. In his 2nd year living as Aaron Fletcher, he started a relationship. Her name was Claire Dawson. She was a waitress at a diner he frequented. They dated for 8 months. She thought his name was Aaron. She thought he worked in shipping. She thought he was quiet and kind and maybe a little sad, but nothing suspicious. When I contacted her, she hadn't heard his name in years. She'd moved on. But she remembered him. She remembered that he never wanted his picture taken, that he paid for everything in cash, that he refused to meet her friends or family, that he would disappear for days without explanation and come back tense, like he'd been running. She said he had a watch he wore constantly, silver, with an engraving on the back. She never saw what it said. He wouldn't let her. One night, she asked him why he was so secretive, why he wouldn't let her in. He told her he'd made mistakes in his past, that he was trying to start over, that some people don't get second chances unless they take them. She didn't push. She wanted to believe him. But 8 months in, he vanished. No goodbye, no explanation. She called his phone, disconnected. She went to his apartment, cleared out. She assumed he'd gotten scared. That commitment had spooked him. She moved on. That was 3 years before his body was found. I asked Claire if he ever mentioned anyone from his past. Friends, family, enemies. She said no. But there was one thing. About a month before he disappeared, he got a phone call while they were together. She couldn't hear the other side, but his face went pale. He stepped outside. When he came back in, he was shaking. He wouldn't talk about it. He just said he had to handle something. She never saw him relaxed after that. I pressed her. Did he say anything? A name? A place? Anything? She hesitated. Then she said he'd muttered something under his breath when he hung up. She hadn't thought about it in years, but now, trying to remember, it came back. He'd said, "He found me." Not they. He. Someone specific. Someone he'd been hiding from. That phone call became the second major lead. But without phone records, without a last name, without anything concrete, it was a dead end for now. I had to approach it from another angle. I went back to the pawn shop receipt. Why keep it? Why fold it into your wallet and carry it for years? Most people pawn things they need money for, desperation sales. They don't come back for the item. But this man had redeemed the watch, paid in full. 2 weeks later. That meant it mattered. It wasn't just valuable, it was personal. The engraving, JRM. I ran those initials against missing persons databases, filtered by age and timeline. I got over 200 hits. Too broad. I narrowed it by region, by physical description, by year of disappearance. One name kept surfacing. Jacob Raymond Miller, reported missing 7 years ago. Last seen leaving his apartment in a northern college town. No body ever found. Case went cold within a year. Jacob Miller had been a graduate student. Quiet, focused, studying environmental science. No criminal record, no debts, no obvious reason to vanish. But his faculty advisor reported that in the months before he disappeared, Jacob had seemed anxious, distracted. He'd asked about legal protections for whistleblowers. He'd mentioned concerns about data integrity in a research project he was working on. The advisor didn't know details. Jacob never elaborated. And then he was gone. I pulled everything I could find on Jacob Miller, his student records, his thesis drafts, his emails to faculty, and I found something interesting. 3 weeks before he vanished, Jacob had sent an email to a professor he trusted. The subject line was blank. The message was 2 sentences. I found something I wasn't supposed to. I don't know who to tell. The professor replied, asking for clarification. Jacob never responded. I contacted the professor. He was retired now, living out of state, but he remembered Jacob. Bright kid, he said. Serious. Not the type to panic over nothing. I asked what research project Jacob had been working on. The professor said it was a contracted study. A private environmental consulting firm had hired the university to assess soil contamination at a commercial site. Standard work. Jacob was the lead research assistant. He handled sample collection, lab analysis, data entry. I asked for the name of the firm. The professor hesitated. Then he said the contract had been terminated abruptly. The firm pulled out, cited budget issues, and the project was shelved. All the data was returned to the client. The university kept no copies. I asked again, what was the firm's name? He gave it to me. The name meant nothing at the time, but I wrote it down. Because 2 days later, when I cross-referenced that firm against property records and storage facility transactions, I found a connection that made my chest tighten. The storage unit where the body was found, Unit 237, had been rented under a shell company. That shell company shared an address with the consulting firm Jacob Miller had worked for. The same firm that had pulled out of the project. The same firm that had reclaimed all of Jacob's research. That was the moment the case stopped being a puzzle and started being a threat. Because if Jacob Miller had found something in that soil data, something someone wanted buried, and if he tried to run by stealing a new identity and vanishing into another life, then his death wasn't random. It was inevitable. Someone had been looking for him, and eventually, someone found him. I made a decision that night. I wasn't going to call the police yet. Not until I had something concrete. Because if this case involved a firm with resources, with lawyers, with the ability to erase contracts and intimidate universities, then I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed or buried. I needed the watch. If Jacob had pawned it once and redeemed it, that meant it was still out there, somewhere in his belongings, or sold off after his death, or kept by whoever killed him. I went back to the medical examiner's office and requested a full inventory of everything found with the body: clothing, wallet contents, personal effects. No watch. I asked if anything had been logged separately, held as evidence, sent to another department. The examiner checked. Nothing. The watch was gone, which meant either it had been taken before the body was dumped, or someone had removed it from evidence after the fact. I filed a records request for the chain of custody logs. It would take weeks, but I needed to know. In the meantime, I started tracing the consulting firm, corporate filings, employee records, project histories. I needed to know what Jacob Miller had discovered and who had the most to lose if it went public. That's when I found the name of the firm's senior project manager at the time Jacob went missing. A man named Richard Holt, 46 years old, former civil engineer. Clean record, no red flags. But when I pulled his employment history, I noticed something. Richard Holt left the consulting firm 6 months after Jacob disappeared. He moved across the country, took a job with a different company, stayed there for 2 years, then moved again. 3 job changes in 5 years, always relocating, always starting over, just like Jacob Miller had. I looked up Richard Holt's current address. He was living alone in a suburban rental. No family listed, no social media, no online presence. I sat in my car outside his building for 3 hours, trying to decide if I was making a mistake. Then I saw him, walking to his car in the parking lot. Mid-40s, greying hair, average build. He looked tired. He looked careful. And on his left wrist, just visible under his sleeve as he unlocked his car, was a silver watch. I got out of my car and started walking toward him. He saw me. He froze. And I knew in that moment that this case was about to get much worse before it got any better. I didn't approach Richard Holt that day. I stayed back, watched him drive away, memorized the license plate. I needed more before I made contact. If he was involved, confronting him too early would give him time to disappear, to lawyer up, to destroy whatever was left. Instead, I followed the watch. I contacted every pawn shop in a 50-mile radius of where Jacob Miller had originally pawned it. I sent them the receipt photo, asked if they'd seen it again, if anyone had tried to sell or pawn a similar item in the years since. Most said no. A few didn't respond. One called me back. A shop about 40 miles south. The owner remembered a watch matching that description. Not pawned, sold outright. About 2 years ago, a man had come in, said it was an estate item, wanted cash fast. The owner bought it, held it for a few months, then sold it to a private buyer who collected vintage pieces. I asked if he remembered anything about the seller. He said the man was nervous, kept his head down. Paid in cash wasn't the right phrase, he corrected himself. The man sold for cash. He wanted to be rid of it. I asked for a description. The owner said late 40s, graying, fit build, wore a jacket even though it was warm outside. Kept his hands in his pockets. That matched Richard Holt. I asked about the buyer. The shop owner didn't have contact info, but he remembered the name from the receipt. A local collector who bought and sold estate jewelry as a side business. I tracked the collector down through online marketplaces. He confirmed he'd bought the watch. He still had it. He'd never been able to sell it, he said, because the engraving made it too personal. People don't want used gifts with someone else's initials. I offered to buy it from him. He named a price. I paid without haggling. When the package arrived 3 days later, I opened it carefully, wearing gloves, documenting everything. The watch was exactly as described. Silver case, leather band, engraved on the back, JRM. I took it to a forensic contact I trusted. I asked for prints, for trace evidence, for anything that might still be on the surface after all this time. It took a week. The results came back clean. Too clean. The watch had been wiped, polished, professionally cleaned before it was sold. But there was one thing, a microscopic engraving inside the case back, visible only under magnification. A jeweler's mark and a date, custom made, 8 years ago, from a small shop 2 states north. I called the jeweler. The shop was still in business. The owner remembered the commission. A young man had ordered it, paid extra for rush service, wanted it engraved as a gift for himself. The owner thought that was odd, but didn't ask questions. I asked if he kept records of the buyer. He did. A name, a phone number, an address. The name was Jacob Raymond Miller. That confirmation locked it in. The body in the storage unit was Jacob Miller. He'd been living as Aaron Fletcher for years, hiding from something or someone, and eventually that someone had found him. Now I had to prove Richard Holt was involved. I pulled everything I could on Holt's background: employment records, tax filings, property leases, vehicle registrations. I built a timeline of his movements over the past 7 years and compared it to Jacob Miller's. There were overlaps, small ones, but consistent. 3 years ago, Richard Holt had lived in the same city where Jacob, as Aaron Fletcher, had rented an apartment. Different neighborhoods, but within 10 miles. 2 years ago, Holt moved again. 6 months later, Jacob moved too. Different state, but both relocated within weeks of each other. It could have been coincidence, but coincidences don't usually involve matching watches and cleaned evidence. I needed to know what Jacob had discovered, what data he'd pulled from that soil study that was worth killing over. I went back to the university where Jacob had studied. I requested archived records, old email servers, anything that might have been missed during the initial missing persons investigation. The university was slow to respond. Bureaucracy, privacy policies, legal clearances. I pushed. I name-dropped the consulting firm. I mentioned that the case was now a homicide investigation and that withholding records could become an obstruction issue. That got their attention. 2 weeks later, I received a file dump. Emails, project notes, lab reports, digitized notebooks from Jacob's research. I spent 3 days going through it all. Most of it was routine. Soil samples, contamination readings, standard environmental assessments. But buried in the middle of the dataset was a draft memo Jacob had written. It was never sent. Saved in his email drafts, dated 2 days before he disappeared. The memo was addressed to the professor he'd emailed. The subject line read, "Contamination results do not match contract scope." The body of the memo explained that the soil samples Jacob had analyzed contained heavy metals and industrial solvents far beyond what the site's operational history should have produced. The contamination was severe. It suggested illegal dumping, possibly hazardous waste disposal, over a period of years. But the consulting firm's final report, the one submitted to the state regulatory agency, had listed the site as low risk. Minor contamination, no action required. Jacob had written in the memo that he believed the data had been altered after he submitted it, that someone at the firm had changed the findings to match what the client wanted. He wrote, "I have copies of the original lab results. I don't know what to do with them. If I come forward, I lose my assistantship, my career. If I stay quiet, people could get sick." The memo ended there, unfinished, never sent. I checked the project records. The site in question had been a commercial property owned by a regional development group. The environmental assessment was required before the land could be rezoned and sold for residential construction. If the contamination had been reported accurately, the sale would have been blocked. The property would have required expensive remediation, possibly triggering legal action against the previous owners. Instead, the report came back clean. The land was sold, houses were built, and Jacob Miller disappeared. I pulled property transaction records. The development group that owned the site had a portfolio of similar projects across 3 states. All involved land acquisitions, environmental clearances, and rapid residential development. The consulting firm that hired Jacob had worked on at least 4 of those projects. I cross-referenced the firm's leadership. Richard Holt's name appeared on 3 of the project filings. He'd been the senior manager, overseeing data review and report submission. He would have seen Jacob's results. He would have known the contamination levels were being misrepresented. And if Jacob had kept copies of the original data, if he'd threatened to go public, Holt would have had motive to silence him. But motive isn't proof. I needed something direct. A connection between Holt and Jacob's death. A witness. A transaction. A mistake. I started pulling financial records, bank statements, credit card activity, anything I could access legally or through investigative databases. Richard Holt's spending patterns were careful. No large withdrawals, no suspicious purchases. But there was one anomaly. 4 months before Jacob's body was found, Holt had rented a storage unit. The facility was the same one where Jacob's body was discovered. The rental was under Holt's name. He'd paid month to month, cash. The unit number was different from where the body was found, but it was in the same building, same hallway. I requested the facility's rental logs. It took some pressure, some carefully worded requests that implied legal liability, but eventually I got them. Holt's unit had been rented for 6 months. Then the payments stopped. The facility tried to contact him, got no response, and eventually cleared out the unit for non-payment. But here's what made my hands shake when I saw it. The unit next to Holt's, Unit 237, had been rented during the same period. The renter's name was listed as Aaron Fletcher. They'd been neighbors. Holt and Jacob, in the same storage facility, renting units within 20 feet of each other. That wasn't coincidence. That was surveillance. Holt had tracked Jacob down. He'd rented a unit nearby, maybe to watch him, to confirm it was really him, to figure out the best way to act. And then, at some point, he'd made his move. I contacted the storage facility manager. I asked if there was any security footage from that time period. The manager laughed. Footage gets overwritten every 30 days, he said. This was years ago. Nothing left. I asked if he remembered either renter. He didn't. High turnover. Hundreds of units. People come and go. I asked if there were any incident reports from that time period. Complaints, disturbances, anything unusual. He checked. There was one note. A noise complaint from another renter. Late at night, someone heard banging and scraping sounds coming from the hallway near Units 236 and 237. Security checked it out, found nothing, logged it as a possible animal in the vents. The date of the complaint was 5 months before Jacob's body was found. I asked for the name of the renter who filed the complaint. The manager said they'd moved out years ago. No forwarding info. Dead end. But it was something. It placed activity in that hallway during the window when Jacob likely died. I needed more. I needed something that would hold up in court. Something that couldn't be explained away. I decided to approach Richard Holt directly, not as an investigator, not confrontational, just a conversation. I'd tell him I was researching a story about environmental consulting firms, about whistleblower cases, about how people handle ethical dilemmas in corporate environments. I'd see how he reacted. I'd listen for tells. I'd record everything. I called him. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail, kept it vague, professional, non-threatening. He called back 3 hours later. His voice was calm, measured. He asked what the story was about. I gave him the pitch. He listened without interrupting. Then he said he wasn't interested. He didn't talk about his past work. He'd moved on. He wished me luck. I pushed gently. I mentioned the consulting firm by name. I said I was particularly interested in projects from 7 or 8 years ago, in how environmental data was reviewed and reported. There was a pause, just a beat too long. Then he said he didn't remember specifics from that long ago. He suggested I contact the firm's legal department if I had questions about old projects. I thanked him. I said I understood. I asked if we could meet anyway, just for background context, off the record. He said no, politely, firmly, and then he hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand, replaying the conversation. He hadn't sounded guilty. He'd sounded careful, like someone who'd practiced this response, like someone who knew exactly how much to say and when to stop. I pulled up his address again. I made a decision that probably crossed a line, but I was past the point of playing it safe. I drove to his building. I parked across the street. I waited. He came out around 8 in the evening. He walked to his car, got in, and drove. I followed at a distance, keeping 2 or 3 cars between us. He didn't go far. A shopping center, a pharmacy. He went inside, came out 10 minutes later with a small bag, drove home. I followed him twice more over the next week. Same routine. Work, home, occasional errands. Nothing unusual. But on the 4th night, he broke pattern. He drove out of town, took a highway south. I stayed back, kept my distance. He drove for 40 minutes, then exited onto a rural road. No streetlights, no traffic. I almost lost him. I had to close the distance just to keep his taillights in view. He turned onto a gravel access road. I stopped at the turnoff, killed my headlights, waited. 5 minutes later, I saw a flashlight beam moving through the trees. I got out of my car, moved quietly toward the tree line, stayed low. Holt was standing in a clearing. He had a duffel bag. He was digging. Not deep, just a shallow scrape in the dirt. He pulled something out of the bag, wrapped in plastic, and buried it. Covered it over, smoothed the dirt, looked around. I took photos, zoomed in as much as I could without compromising the angle. I couldn't see what he'd buried, but I got shots of him, the bag, the location. He finished. He walked back to his car. He drove away. I waited until his taillights disappeared. Then I moved into the clearing. I found the spot. Fresh dirt, easy to see. I didn't dig it up. Not yet. I needed to do this right. I needed witnesses, documentation, chain of custody. I called a contact I had in the sheriff's department, someone I trusted. I explained the situation. I sent her the photos. I gave her the location. She said she'd get a team out there first thing in the morning. She told me to go home. Let them handle it. I didn't go home. I stayed in my car on the side of the road, watching the access point, making sure no one else came by. At dawn, 2 sheriff's vehicles arrived. I met them at the turnoff. I walked them to the clearing. I showed them the spot. They excavated carefully, photographed everything. Within 30 minutes, they'd uncovered what Holt had buried. A plastic wrap bundle. Inside, a laptop, a flash drive, and a folder of printed documents. The documents were land assessment reports. The laptop was old, password protected. The flash drive was labeled in faint pen. Original data, Miller. Jacob Miller's missing research, the original contamination results, the evidence he'd kept, the reason he'd run. And Richard Holt had held on to it all this time. The sheriff's contact asked how I'd known it was here. I explained the surveillance, the pattern break, the photos. She didn't look happy about the methods, but she didn't shut me down either. She said they'd process everything, run the laptop, analyze the data, see if it matched what I'd found in the university archives. I asked what would happen next. She said if the evidence tied Holt to Jacob's death, they'd bring him in for questioning. If it tied him to data falsification and corporate fraud, they'd loop in federal agencies. Either way, it was out of my hands now. I nodded. I thanked her. I drove home. But I didn't sleep, because I knew Richard Holt was careful. I knew he'd been watching his back for years. And I knew that the moment he realized the evidence had been dug up, he'd disappear. I was right. By the time the sheriff's department ran the laptop password and confirmed the data matched Jacob's research, Richard Holt was gone. His apartment was cleared out. His car was found abandoned at a bus station 2 counties over. No forwarding address. No phone contact. No credit card activity. He'd vanished, just like Jacob Miller had. Just like he'd probably planned to do if things ever got too close. But this time, he left something behind. The laptop had a browser history. Holt hadn't wiped it. Maybe he'd been in a hurry. Maybe he thought burying it was enough. The history showed repeated searches over the past 2 years. Searches for Aaron Fletcher. Searches for storage facilities. Searches for pawn shops in specific zip codes. He'd been hunting Jacob for years, methodically, patiently. And buried in the search history was one more thing. A saved map location. Coordinates. I pulled them up. The coordinates pointed to a rural property about 90 miles north. Undeveloped land. No structures. Owned by a holding company that traced back, after several layers, to the same development group that had hired the consulting firm. The sheriff's contact agreed to check it out. They brought cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, a full forensic team. It took 2 days of searching. They found 3 more bodies. All male, all buried in shallow graves, all in various states of decomposition. The oldest had been there for over a decade. None of them had identification, but dental records and DNA eventually gave them names. 2 were former employees of the consulting firm. Both had left suddenly. No forwarding information. Listed as voluntary resignations. The 3rd was a regulatory inspector who'd gone missing 6 years ago. He'd been investigating contamination complaints at a different site, also owned by the development group. Richard Holt hadn't just killed Jacob Miller. He'd been cleaning up loose ends for years. Anyone who saw too much, anyone who asked the wrong questions, anyone who threatened the pipeline of fraudulent reports and profitable land deals. The case broke open after that. Federal investigators took over. The consulting firm's records were seized. The development group's projects were audited. Contaminated sites were identified. Residents were tested for exposure. It was bigger than I'd expected. Worse than I'd expected. And Richard Holt was still out there. They issued warrants. They flagged his passport. They monitored bank accounts and known associates. But months passed. No sightings, no leads. I kept working the case, even though it wasn't officially mine anymore. I followed up on tips. I checked in with the families of the other victims. I wrote everything down. Because I knew one thing. People like Richard Holt don't stop. They adapt. They wait. They find new identities, new lives, new ways to stay hidden. Just like Jacob Miller had tried to do. And just like Jacob, eventually, Holt would make a mistake. I just had to be ready. When he did, the investigation stalled for 3 months. Federal agencies coordinated with state police, but Richard Holt had gone to ground in a way that suggested experience. No digital footprint, no financial activity under his name, no border crossings flagged. But I kept digging, because there was something that didn't sit right. The watch. Holt had sold Jacob's watch 2 years before the body was found. That meant he'd taken it off Jacob's body, held onto it for years, and then suddenly decided to get rid of it. Why then? Why not immediately after the killing? Why keep it at all? I went back through Holt's financial records, the ones I'd already compiled. I looked at the timeline again. The watch was sold 4 months before Holt rented the storage unit. 4 months before he positioned himself next to Jacob. That sequence was backwards. If Holt had killed Jacob and taken the watch as a trophy or to prevent identification, the watch would have disappeared at the time of death. But he'd sold it before the murder, which meant he'd had it earlier, much earlier. I revisited the pawn shop records, the original transaction, 4 years before the body was found. Jacob had pawned the watch, then redeemed it 2 weeks later. But what if he hadn't redeemed it himself? I called the pawn shop owner again. I asked if he remembered anything else about the redemption. Who came in, what they looked like, how they paid. He thought about it. Then he said something I hadn't caught the first time. He said the person who redeemed it wasn't the same person who pawned it. Different build, different age. But the ticket matched, and the payment was correct, so he'd release the item. That was standard practice. Anyone with the ticket and the cash could claim it. I asked if he remembered anything specific about the person who redeemed it. He said middle-aged, professional looking, paid cash, didn't make small talk, left quickly. That was Richard Holt. It had to be. Which meant Holt had intercepted Jacob's pawn ticket. He'd redeemed the watch before Jacob could, and that meant Holt had been close to Jacob much earlier than I'd thought. Close enough to steal from him. Close enough to track his movements. The timeline shifted in my head. Holt hadn't just found Jacob after years of searching. He'd been shadowing him for years. Watching, waiting, controlling the situation. Maybe he'd been waiting for Jacob to lead him to the original data. Maybe he'd been trying to figure out if Jacob had told anyone else. Maybe he was just sadistic enough to let Jacob think he was safe before closing in. Either way, it meant Holt was patient, disciplined, and that made him more dangerous now because he'd gone underground with the same skill set. I needed to think like him. Where would someone like Holt go? How would he rebuild? I started mapping his past. Not just his employment, but his patterns. The cities he'd lived in. The types of neighborhoods. The kinds of jobs he took. He favored mid-sized towns. Places big enough to blend in. small enough that housing was cheap and questions were few. He avoided cities with strong regional identity or tight-knit communities. He worked contract jobs, short-term positions, nothing that required deep vetting. I built a profile. Then I sent it to a private investigator I'd worked with before, someone who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. Her name was Marcy Delgado, former skip tracer, now independent. She had contacts in industries where people moved frequently and identities were loosely verified: hospitality, logistics, construction. I gave her everything I had on Holt: photos, physical description, behavioral patterns, known skills. She said she'd put out feelers. It would take time. People like Holt didn't surface in databases. They surfaced through whispers. Someone recognizing a face, someone noticing a pattern. While I waited, I focused on the other victims. The 3 bodies found on the rural property: 2 former employees, 1 inspector. I wanted to know how Holt had targeted them, what mistakes they'd made, what signs they'd missed. The first employee, a man named Dennis Corman, had worked in the firm's data management division. He'd been responsible for digitizing field reports and maintaining the archive. He'd left the company 7 years ago, citing personal reasons. No one had heard from him since. I contacted his family. His sister still lived in the area. She'd filed a missing persons report at the time, but the investigation had gone nowhere. Dennis had been an adult, no signs of foul play. People assumed he'd wanted a fresh start. His sister said Dennis had been stressed before he disappeared. He'd mentioned problems at work, something about discrepancies he'd noticed in old files. He'd talked about going to management, but then he'd stopped talking about it altogether. A week later, he was gone. She said he'd left most of his belongings behind. His apartment lease had been paid through the end of the month. His car was found at a park-and-ride lot near a bus terminal. It was the same pattern as Jacob, same method of disappearance. Clean, deliberate, designed to look voluntary. I asked if Dennis had ever mentioned Richard Holt. She didn't recognize the name, but when I showed her a photo of Holt, she hesitated. Then she said Dennis had pointed out a co-worker once, months before he vanished. They'd been at a company picnic. Dennis had seemed uneasy. He told her to stay away from that guy, said he gave him a bad feeling. She couldn't be certain, but the man in the photo looked similar. I moved on to the second employee, a woman named Lori Tsao. She'd been a junior geologist at the firm. She'd resigned abruptly 6 years ago. Her exit interview cited a family emergency. No one followed up. Her family reported her missing 4 months later. She'd told them she was moving for a new job, promised to stay in touch, then vanished. I spoke to her younger brother. He said Lori had always been cautious. She wouldn't just disappear. Something had scared her. He said she'd called him once, a few days before she went silent. She'd sounded rattled. She'd said she'd seen something at work, something in an old project file that didn't match current records. She'd planned to ask her supervisor about it. He never heard from her again. I asked if she'd mentioned the supervisor's name. He didn't remember, but he still had her last voicemail saved on his phone. He played it for me. Her voice was tight, nervous. She said she'd talked to someone at work. She said the person had been defensive, told her to drop it, told her the files were confidential, and she didn't have clearance to review them. She said she didn't feel safe. She was going to leave. She'd call him when she got settled. The voicemail ended there. I asked if he'd given this to police. He said yes. They'd listened. They'd noted it in the report. But without a name, without specifics, there was nothing actionable. I asked if Laurie had ever mentioned anyone by name in previous conversations. Any co-worker she didn't trust. He thought hard. Then he said there was one person, a man she'd complained about once. She'd said he was always watching people, always asking questions that felt too personal. She'd called him creepy. She'd avoided being alone with him. I showed him Holt's photo. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said he thought that might be him. He couldn't be sure, but the face felt familiar in a bad way. The third victim was the regulatory inspector. His name was Paul Everett. He'd worked for the State Environmental Agency. He'd been assigned to review contamination complaints at a commercial site owned by the development group. His disappearance had been treated more seriously than the others. He was a government employee. His case file was thicker, but the leads had dried up. His car was found abandoned near a hiking trail. Search teams scoured the area. No body, no evidence. The assumption was misadventure, a fall, a medical event, something that left him lost in the wilderness. Except now, his body had been found 90 miles away, buried with the others. I reviewed his case file. His last known activity was a site visit. He'd gone to the property in question, taken soil samples, filed a preliminary report noting elevated contamination levels. The report recommended further testing and a hold on any development permits until remediation could be assessed. 2 days later, he'd called his supervisor and said he was following up on an anomaly. He'd noticed that previous reports on the same site, filed by a private consulting firm, had listed the contamination as minimal. He wanted to compare methodologies. He'd requested copies of the consulting firm's raw data. His supervisor told him to go through official channels. Paul said he would. He never made it back to the office. The consulting firm he'd wanted to investigate was the same firm where Holt had worked, the same firm that had hired Jacob Miller. Paul Everett had gotten too close. He'd asked the wrong questions, and Richard Holt had removed him. 3 victims, all connected to the same web of falsified reports and covered up contamination, all eliminated when they threatened to expose it. And Jacob Miller had been the one who'd lasted the longest. He'd run. He'd hidden. He'd tried to disappear completely. But Holt had found him anyway. I compiled everything into a single case file. I sent copies to the federal investigators, to the sheriff's department, to Marcy Delgado. I wanted everyone working this to see the full picture. Because Richard Holt wasn't just a murderer, he was a systematic cleaner. Someone who understood how to identify threats and eliminate them before they became public. And he'd been doing it for over a decade. Marcy called me 2 weeks later. She said she'd gotten a hit. Not confirmation, but a lead worth following. A man matching Holt's description had been seen working at a freight company in a southwestern town. Short-term contract position, loading dogs, paid weekly in cash. He'd been using a different name. He kept to himself, didn't socialize. One of Marcy's contacts, a warehouse supervisor, had noticed him because he was overqualified. The guy moved like someone who'd had desk jobs, not labor jobs. He was careful, methodical, efficient, but he didn't belong. The supervisor had taken a photo from the security camera feed. Not official, just curious. Marcy sent me the image. It was grainy, taken from a high angle, but the build was right. The posture was right. The age looked close. I couldn't be certain, but it was the best lead we'd had in months. I forwarded the image to the FBI contact handling the case. They ran facial recognition. The software flagged it as a possible match, but not definitive. Lighting and angle made confirmation difficult. They sent agents to the town. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. He'd finished his contract 2 days earlier, left no forwarding information. But the agents canvassed the area. They found a motel where he'd stayed. The clerk remembered him. Quiet guy, paid cash, kept odd hours. The room had been cleaned, but the agents processed it anyway. They found a single fingerprint on the underside of the bathroom sink, in a spot housekeeping usually missed. The print matched Richard Holt. He'd been there. We'd been close. But he was gone again. The agents expanded the search. They checked bus terminals, truck stops, rideshare logs. They interviewed freight company employees. They pulled traffic camera footage from nearby highways. Nothing solid, but they did find one thing. A truck driver remembered giving a hitchhiker a ride about a week earlier, picked him up at a rest stop, dropped him off 2 states over. Middle-aged guy, fit, didn't talk much, said he was heading east for family reasons. The driver couldn't ID Holt from a photo, but the timeline and description matched. If Holt was heading east, that opened up a dozen possible routes and hundreds of potential destinations. But it also meant he was moving, and people who move leave traces. I started thinking about his next steps. If I were him, where would I go? He'd need work, cash jobs, places that didn't ask questions. He'd need housing, short-term rentals, weekly motels, maybe even squatting in vacant properties. He'd avoid anywhere he'd been before. Too much risk. He'd pick places where he had no history, no connections. But he'd also need to feel secure. He'd need to know he could watch his back. That meant small towns, low population density, places where strangers were noticed but not immediately reported. I mapped towns along eastern routes that fit the profile. 40 possibilities, too many to cover alone. I contacted Marcy again. I asked if she could deploy people to key locations. Watch freight companies, temp agencies, motels. Look for men matching Holt's description, especially if they were using cash and avoiding documentation. She said it would be expensive. I told her I'd figure out the money. This wasn't about budget anymore. This was about stopping someone who'd killed at least 4 people and would kill again if he felt cornered. She put together a network, 5 people scattered across the region, each covering a cluster of towns. They checked in daily, shared photos, compared notes. For 3 weeks, nothing. Then one of Marcy's people, a former cop named Lane Rucker, called in. He'd been staking out a temp agency in a rural town. A man had come in that morning, asked about day labor. filled out minimal paperwork. The name was different. The ID looked legitimate. But the man's behavior stood out. Lane said the guy had been hyper-aware, checked exits, watched other people, kept his back to the wall. Classic fugitive behavior. Lane took a discreet photo as the man left. He sent it to me. It was Richard Holt. No question this time. The angle was better. The lighting was clear. I called the FBI immediately. I gave them the location. I told them to move fast. They scrambled a team, but by the time they arrived, Holt was gone again. The temp agency said he'd taken a one-day job at a construction site on the edge of town. The site supervisor said he'd worked half a shift, then left during lunch break. Said he wasn't feeling well. No one had seen him since. But we were getting closer. He was making mistakes, moving too frequently, drawing attention. The FBI set up a perimeter. They interviewed everyone at the construction site. They pulled security footage from nearby businesses. They traced his movements backward, trying to figure out where he'd been staying. They found a boarded-up house 3 blocks from the temp agency. The back door had been forced. Inside, they found evidence of recent occupation. Sleeping bag, food wrappers, a battery-powered radio, and in the corner, under a pile of old newspapers, they found a duffel bag. Inside the bag, a handgun, a fake ID in a new name, $2,000 in cash, and a notebook. The notebook was small, spiral-bound, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, dates, locations, names. It was a log, Holt's personal record of his movements over the past 4 months. Every town he'd passed through, every job he'd taken, every place he'd slept. And on the last page, a list, 4 names: Dennis Corman, Laurie Tsao, Paul Everett, Jacob Miller. Next to each name, a single word: resolved. Underneath the list, one more name, not crossed out, not marked. My name. I stared at the photo of the notebook page that the FBI had sent me. My name, written in Holt's handwriting, added to his list. He knew I was hunting him, and now he was hunting me. The FBI agent in charge, a woman named Carla Vinson, called me directly. She said they were taking the threat seriously. She asked where I was staying. She said they'd arranged protection. I told her I wasn't going into hiding. I'd worked this case for too long to stop now. But I'd be careful. I'd stay in contact. I'd report anything unusual. She didn't like it, but she didn't push. She knew I wasn't going to back down. Instead, she assigned a 2-person detail to keep an eye on my location. Plainclothes, discreet, just in case Holt tried to make a move. I went back to my apartment. I locked the doors. I checked the windows. I kept my phone charged and within reach. And I started thinking about what Holt's endgame might be. He was cornered. He knew law enforcement was closing in. He'd left evidence behind. His face was flagged in every database. He had 2 options: disappear completely, which was getting harder every day, or eliminate the people who posed the biggest threat. I was on that list. So were the federal investigators. So was Marcy. But I was the most accessible. I wasn't law enforcement. I didn't have a team. I was working alone, exposed, predictable. If Holt wanted to send a message, to buy himself time, to create chaos, I was the easiest target. I stayed inside for 2 days. I worked from my laptop. I kept the blinds closed. I let the protection detail do their job. On the 3rd day, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, familiar. It was Richard Holt. He said my name. He said he'd been following my work. He said he respected the effort, but he wanted me to understand something. He said the people he'd killed weren't innocent. They'd been threats. They'd made choices that put them in his path. He'd simply responded to those choices. He said I was making the same mistake. I was pushing too hard. I was making myself a problem. He said he didn't want to add me to the list, but he would if I didn't stop. I kept my voice steady. I asked him why he was calling. He said because he wanted to give me a chance. He said if I backed off, if I let the case go cold, he'd disappear for good. No one else would get hurt. But if I kept pushing, if I kept coordinating with law enforcement, if I kept putting his face out there, then I'd be responsible for what happened next. I told him it was too late. The case was federal now. I wasn't the only one hunting him. He laughed, soft, bitter. He said I was the only one who understood the full picture. I was the one who'd connected the dots. Without me, the case would fragment. It would become paperwork. He'd slip through. He said I had 48 hours to decide. Then he hung up. I immediately called Agent Vincent. I told her about the call. She traced the number. It was a burner phone, no location data. The call had bounced through multiple towers, making triangulation impossible. But the fact that he'd called meant he was still in the region, close enough to monitor me, close enough to act. Vincent increased the protection detail. She brought in additional agents. She wanted me to relocate to a safe house. I refused. I told her if Holt was watching me, then my apartment was the best place to draw him out. If I disappeared, he'd know we were onto him. He'd vanish again. But if I stayed visible, predictable, he might make a mistake. Vincent didn't like it, but she understood the logic. She wired my apartment, cameras, audio, motion sensors. She positioned agents in adjacent units and across the street. She set up a rapid response protocol. If Holt showed up, they'd have him in seconds. I became bait. I hated it, but it was the only move that made sense. I resumed my normal routine. I left the apartment for groceries. I went to the library to work. I made myself visible. The protection detail shadowed me everywhere. I could feel them, even when I couldn't see them. Days passed. Nothing. Holt didn't call again. He didn't approach. He didn't make contact. Maybe he'd sensed the trap. Maybe he'd decided I wasn't worth the risk. Or maybe he was just waiting. On the 6th day, I got a message. Not a call, a text. From another unknown number. It was a photo. A security camera image. Timestamped from 2 hours earlier. The image showed Marcy Delgado walking into a coffee shop. The text below the image read, "She's easier." My hands went cold. I called Marcy immediately. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. I called Vincent. I told her what had happened. She scrambled a team to Marcy's last known location. I gave them the address of the coffee shop from the image. It was 3 towns over, an hour's drive. I got in my car. The protection detail tried to stop me. I ignored them. They followed. I drove faster than I should have. I called Marcy every few minutes. No answer. When I reached the coffee shop, there were already 2 police cars outside. Agent Vincent was there. She saw me pull up and walked over before I could get out. Her face was tight. She said Marcy's car was in the parking lot. Her phone was inside the vehicle, on the passenger seat. But Marcy was gone. They were reviewing security footage. They were interviewing staff. But so far, no one had seen her leave. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. Holt had taken her. And it was because of me. Because I'd brought her into this. Because I'd made her visible. Vincent put a hand on my shoulder. She said it wasn't my fault. She said Holt was escalating. He was making desperate moves. That meant he was close to breaking. But I didn't feel relief. I felt responsibility. I asked what the plan was. She said they were treating it as an active kidnapping. They'd issued alerts. They were tracking Holt's known patterns. They were checking abandoned properties, rural sites, anywhere he might take someone. I asked how much time we had. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. If Holt had taken Marcy, it was because he wanted leverage, or because he wanted to send a message. Either way, we didn't have long. The FBI set up a command post in a vacant office building near the coffee shop. Phones, laptops, tactical maps spread across folding tables. Agent Vincent coordinated with local police, state agencies, and federal teams. Everyone was looking for Marcy Delgado and Richard Holt. I stood in the corner, trying to stay out of the way, trying to think. Holt had grabbed Marcy in broad daylight from a public location. That was bold. Reckless, even. It meant he was either confident he could move without being spotted, or he was past the point of caring. I pulled up the security camera image he'd sent me. I zoomed in on the background, the coffee shop parking lot. A few cars, trees, a street sign barely visible at the edge of the frame. I forwarded the image to one of the analysts Vincent had on site. I asked them to enhance the background, see if there was anything identifiable. They worked fast. Within 20 minutes, they'd pulled metadata from the image. The photo had been taken from a phone with location services disabled, but the analyst was able to match the angle and background details to the coffee shop's exterior camera positioning. That confirmed Holt had been there, close enough to watch, close enough to time his move. But where had he taken her? I thought about his pattern, the rural property where the other bodies had been found, the storage facility, the boarded-up house. He favored places that were isolated, off-grid, forgotten. I pulled up a map of the area surrounding the coffee shop. I filtered for abandoned properties, foreclosed homes, rural land with no recent activity. There were dozens of possibilities within a 50-mile radius. Vincent's team was already working the same angle. They'd divided the area into sectors and were dispatching units to check each location. But it was slow. Every site had to be approached carefully. Holt was armed. If he felt cornered, he might kill Marcy immediately. I needed to narrow it down. Think like him. Where would he go? He'd want somewhere he could control. Somewhere with limited access. Somewhere he could see anyone coming. I cross-referenced the property list with topography maps. I looked for elevated positions, single-access roads, places surrounded by open fields or dense woods. One location stood out, a defunct hunting cabin about 40 miles northeast. The property had been abandoned for years. The access road was overgrown. Satellite images showed thick tree cover and a small clearing with a single structure. It fit. I showed it to Vincent. She flagged it as priority. She dispatched a tactical unit and told them to approach with caution. Then she told me to stay put. She said this was law enforcement work now. I'd done my part. I nodded, but I didn't mean it. As soon as the tactical unit left, I slipped out of the command post. My protection detail tried to follow, but I moved fast, got in my car, and headed northeast before they could stop me. I knew the route. I'd memorized it from the map. I stayed off the main roads, took back highways, kept my phone on, but ignored the calls coming in from Vincent. I wasn't trying to play hero. I just needed to be there. Marcy was in danger because of me. I couldn't sit in a command post while someone else tried to fix it. The drive took 50 minutes. I turned onto the access road and killed my headlights. The road was narrow, rutted, barely passable. Tree branches scraped against the car. I drove slowly, watching for any sign of the tactical unit. I saw their vehicles parked about a quarter mile from the cabin. Blacked out SUVs, positioned off the road. I pulled in behind them and got out. An agent immediately approached me. He recognized me from the command post. He told me I needed to leave. This was an active operation. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. He started to argue. Then his radio crackled. The team leader's voice came through, low and controlled. They'd reached the cabin. They had visual on a vehicle parked behind the structure. No movement inside, no lights. They were holding position, waiting for confirmation. The agent listening to the radio turned to me. He said if I stayed, I had to stay back. No interference, no communication, just observation. I agreed. We moved forward on foot, staying low, using the tree line for cover. The cabin came into view through the branches. Small, single-story, wood siding rotted and sagging. The vehicle parked behind it was a sedan, dark color, covered in dust. The tactical team was positioned around the perimeter. They had the exits covered. They had sightlines on the windows. The team leader signaled. 2 agents moved to the front door. 2 more covered the back. The rest held position. The lead agent knocked, announced law enforcement, ordered anyone inside to come out with hands visible. Silence. He knocked again. Louder. Same announcement. Still nothing. He tested the door. Locked. He signaled to breach. One of the agents stepped forward with a ram. And that's when I heard it. A voice from inside, muffled, distorted, shouting. It wasn't Holt's voice. It was a woman's. Marcy. The team leader held up a hand. Stop. Don't breach yet. He called out again, asked if anyone was injured, asked Marcy to respond if she could hear him. Her voice came again. She was saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a warning. The team leader turned to the others. He said they were going in. He said to expect resistance. They moved fast. The ram hit the door. It splintered. The agents flooded inside, weapons raised, voices overlapping in commands. I stayed back, watched the windows, listened. Seconds stretched. Then the team leader's voice on the radio. Clear. Subject not present. Victim located. I exhaled. Marcy was alive. But Holt was gone. The agents brought Marcy out a few minutes later. She was shaken, dehydrated, but walking on her own. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back. One of the agents cut them loose. She saw me. She looked angry and relieved at the same time. I started toward her, but an agent stepped in my path. He told me to wait. They needed to secure the scene first. I watched as they escorted Marcy to one of the SUVs. A medic checked her over. Vincent arrived moments later, driving hard up the access road. She got out and went straight to Marcy. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Marcy gesturing, pointing back at the cabin, talking fast. Vincent listened, then turned and walked over to me. Her expression was unreadable. She said Holt had been there. He'd held Marcy in the cabin for hours. He'd tied her up, left her in the corner, and spent the time pacing, talking to himself, making plans. But he'd left 2 hours before the tactical team arrived. He told Marcy he knew law enforcement was closing in. He said he had one more thing to take care of. Then he'd driven away. I asked if Marcy knew where he was going. Vincent nodded. She said Holt had been ranting, talking about how the case had spiraled, how too many people knew too much, how he needed to cut the head off the problem. He'd said my name multiple times. He was coming for me. Vincent told me I was going into protective custody immediately. No arguments, no exceptions. Holt was fixated. He saw me as the catalyst. If he couldn't disappear, he'd make sure I didn't either. I wanted to argue, but I didn't, because I knew she was right. They put me in one of the SUVs, 2 agents in the front. Vincent followed in another vehicle. We drove back to the city, lights off, taking evasive routes. They brought me to a federal safe house on the outskirts of town. Nondescript building, gated entrance, cameras everywhere. Inside, it was sterile. Conference room, kitchen, a few bedrooms. Agents stationed at every door. Vincent sat me down. She said they had units searching for Holt. They had his vehicle description. They had alerts out to every agency in the region. It was only a matter of time. I asked how much time. She didn't answer. I spent the next 12 hours in that safe house. No phone, no internet, just waiting. Agents rotated shifts. I tried to sleep. Couldn't. Around dawn, Vincent came back. She looked exhausted. She said they'd found Holt's vehicle, abandoned in a parking garage downtown. He'd switched cars. They were reviewing traffic cameras, trying to track his new vehicle. I asked if there had been any sightings. She said no. but they'd found something in the abandoned car. A handwritten note left on the dashboard. The note was addressed to me. Vincent handed me a photocopy. The handwriting was neat, controlled. It read, "You made this personal. You didn't have to. You could have let it go. Now we're both trapped. I'll finish what I started. Then I'll finish you. One way or another, this ends today." I stared at the note. The words felt cold. Final. Vincent said they were increasing security. They were preparing for multiple scenarios. If Holt tried to approach the safe house, they'd be ready. But I knew Holt wouldn't come here. He was too smart for that. He'd wait. He'd watch. He'd find a moment when I was exposed. And I couldn't stay in this safe house forever. I told Vincent I wanted to help. I wanted to be part of the operation, not hidden away like a witness. She said no. My job was to stay alive. Their job was to catch Holt. I pushed back. I told her I knew Holt's psychology better than anyone. I'd been studying him for months. I could predict his moves. She considered it. Then she said if I had insights, I could share them from here. She'd relay them to the field teams. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was something. I spent the next few hours going over everything I knew about Holt. His patterns, his decision-making, his pressure points. I told Vincent he'd been meticulous for years, but now he was unraveling. He'd made mistakes. He'd left evidence. He'd taken risks. That meant he was operating on emotion now, not logic. He was angry. He felt betrayed. He saw me as the person who destroyed his carefully built life, which meant he wouldn't run. Not yet. He'd want closure. He'd want to prove he was still in control. I told Vincent he'd come after me directly, not at the safe house, but somewhere public, somewhere he could make a statement. She asked where. I thought about it. Where would Holt feel most powerful? Where could he control the environment? Then it hit me. The original crime scene. The storage facility where Jacob Miller's body had been found. It was symbolic. It was where the case had started. It was where Holt had made his first major mistake by leaving the body in a rented unit. If he wanted to reclaim control, to prove he was still the one dictating terms, he'd go back there. Vincent looked skeptical. She said it was too obvious. Holt was smarter than that. I told her that was the point. Holt wasn't thinking strategically anymore. He was thinking emotionally, and emotion made people predictable. She didn't agree, but she said she'd send a unit to check the facility anyway, just in case. I asked if I could go with them. She said absolutely not, but I could see her weighing it. She knew I was right about Holt's psychology, and she knew that if Holt saw me there, it might push him to act, to make a mistake. She made a call, conferred with her team. Then she came back. She said I could go, but I'd be in a vehicle with armed agents. I wouldn't leave the vehicle. I wouldn't engage. I was there as bait, nothing more. I agreed. They fitted me with a vest. They briefed me on the protocol. They positioned me in the back of an unmarked SUV with 2 agents up front. We drove to the storage facility. It was midday. The place looked different in daylight. Less menacing. Just another commercial lot with rows of orange doors and chain link fencing. Vincent's team had already set up a perimeter. Plainclothes agents posed as customers, snipers positioned on nearby rooftops, cameras monitoring every angle. We parked in the lot, 2 rows back from the main building. I could see Unit 237 from where I sat. The door was still sealed with police tape. Nothing happened for the first hour. Agents rotated positions, checked in over comms, scanned for any sign of Holt. I watched the entrance, watched the cars coming and going, watched for anyone who moved wrong, looked too carefully, lingered too long. Then I saw him. He was walking across the parking lot, casual, head down, hands in his pockets. He looked like any other customer. But I recognized the posture, the gait, the deliberate calm. It was Richard Holt. I reached for the radio to alert the agents in front, but before I could speak, Holt stopped. He turned. He looked directly at the SUV. At me. He smiled. Then he raised his right hand. He was holding something. Small. Black. A detonator. The agent in the driver's seat saw it. He shouted into the radio. Code red. Explosive device. Holt pressed the button. The explosion came from the far end of the storage facility, a unit on the opposite side of the building. The blast was loud, sharp, followed by a fireball that rolled up into the sky. Alarms blared. People screamed. Agents scrambled toward the blast site. And in the chaos, Holt ran. He moved fast, not toward the explosion, toward us. The agents in the front seat jumped out, weapons drawn. They shouted for Holt to stop. He didn't. He pulled a gun from his jacket, fired twice. The agents dove for cover. Holt kept coming. I was alone in the back seat, unarmed, trapped. He reached the SUV. He yanked open the back door. I tried to move. He grabbed me by the vest, pulled me out, shoved me to the ground. I looked up. He was standing over me, gun pointed at my chest. He was breathing hard. His face was flushed, but his hand was steady. He said he'd told me to stop. He said I hadn't listened. I didn't respond. I kept my eyes on his. He said this was my fault, all of it. The case going federal, the bodies being found, his life being destroyed. He said he'd tried to give me a way out, but I'd chosen this. I heard voices shouting, agents moving in, but they were too far. If Holt pulled the trigger, they wouldn't reach me in time. I asked him why he'd done it, why he'd killed those people. What was worth all this? He laughed, bitter, tired. He said it was never supposed to get this far. He'd been protecting the firm, protecting the clients, protecting the money. It was just business. But people kept asking questions. People kept threatening to expose the data. So he'd handled it, quietly, efficiently. Until Jacob Miller. Jacob had run. Jacob had hidden. And Holt had spent years tracking him, waiting for the right moment. He said he'd almost let Jacob go. Almost decided it wasn't worth the risk. But then Jacob had reached out to someone. An old colleague. Someone who might still have access to the original research. Holt couldn't take that chance. So he'd moved. He'd eliminated the threat. And now I was the threat. The one person who'd connected all the pieces. The one person who could testify, could explain the full scope, could ensure he never walked free. He said he couldn't let that happen. He raised the gun. I closed my eyes. I heard the shot, but I didn't feel it. I opened my eyes. Holt was on the ground, blood spreading across his shoulder. His gun had fallen a few feet away. An agent was standing behind him, weapon still raised. She'd taken the shot from 30 yards. Clean, non-lethal, perfect. Holt was gasping, clutching his shoulder, trying to reach for the gun. 3 agents swarmed him, cuffed him, pulled him to his feet. Vincent was there. She looked at me, asked if I was hurt. I shook my head. I couldn't speak. She turned to Holt. She read him his rights. He was still struggling, still trying to talk, but the words were incoherent. They loaded him into an ambulance. Agents climbed in with him. He'd be treated, then transported to a federal holding facility. I stood in the parking lot, watching the ambulance drive away. Fire crews were extinguishing the blaze at the far end of the facility. No one had been hurt in the explosion. Holt had chosen an empty unit, a diversion, not a massacre. He'd wanted me, not collateral damage. Vincent walked over. She put a hand on my shoulder. She said it was over. I nodded, but it didn't feel over. Because Richard Holt was alive. He'd be tried. He'd face justice. But he'd also have a platform. He'd have lawyers. He'd have a chance to tell his version of the story. And I'd have to sit through it, testify, relive every moment of the investigation. But that was the price of closure. I spent the next week giving statements, formal interviews with federal prosecutors. They were building the case. Multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, data falsification, conspiracy. Holt was facing life without parole. Marcy recovered. She'd been bruised, dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. She called me once, after she was released from observation. She said she didn't blame me. She said she'd known the risks. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I appreciated the words. The families of the other victims were notified. Dennis Coleman's sister, Laurie Tauer's brother, Paul Everett's widow. They finally had answers. It didn't bring anyone back, but it gave them something, an end to the uncertainty. Jacob Miller's case was closed. His real identity was confirmed. His family, what was left of them, were located. They thought he'd abandoned them years ago. Now, they knew the truth. The contaminated sites were investigated. The development group faced lawsuits. The consulting firm was shut down. Criminal charges were filed against executives who'd knowingly falsified reports. It was bigger than one man. It was systemic. But Richard Holt had been the enforcer, the one who'd ensured the system stayed hidden. And now the system was exposed. The trial took 8 months to reach court. I testified for 2 days. I walked the jury through the investigation, the timeline, the evidence, the connections. Holt sat at the defense table, silent. His lawyers argued coercion. They argued he'd been following orders. They argued the murders were acts of desperation, not premeditation. The jury didn't buy it. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Life without parole. 4 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each victim. Holt showed no reaction. He was led out of the courtroom in chains. I watched him go. I waited for some feeling of relief, satisfaction, closure. It didn't come. Because 4 people were still dead. Because Jacob Miller had spent years running, terrified, alone. Because the watch he'd cherished, the one piece of his real identity he'd kept, had ended up in a pawn shop, handled by strangers. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow. I left the courthouse. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, not starting the engine. Eventually, I drove home. I filed the case documents. I archived the recordings. I closed the folder. But I didn't forget. Because cases like this don't end. They echo. They leave marks. On the families. On the investigators. On everyone who gets close enough to see the truth. Richard Holt was in prison. He'd never walk free. But the fear he'd created, the lives he'd destroyed, those would linger. And somewhere, in another town, another person was probably making the same choices he'd made, protecting secrets, eliminating threats, convincing themselves it was necessary. That's the part that keeps me awake, not the case I solved, the ones I haven't found yet, the ones still waiting to be discovered. I took a month off after the trial. I told myself I needed distance, perspective, time to process everything that had happened. But distance didn't help. I'd wake up at 3 a.m, thinking about the timeline, the points where someone could have intervened, the moments where Jacob Miller might have been saved if the system had worked differently. I thought about the phone call Jacob never made, the email he never sent, the warnings he'd kept to himself because he was afraid of losing his career. Fear had kept him silent, and silence had killed him. I started going through my old case files, not for work, just for something to do. I needed to remind myself that some cases did get solved, that some families did get answers. But I kept coming back to the contamination reports, the ones Jacob had flagged, the ones Richard Holt had altered. The consulting firm was gone, the executives were facing charges, but the damage was already done. Those residential developments had been built. Families were living on contaminated land. Children were playing in yards where the soil contained heavy metals and industrial solvents. The state had launched an investigation. Testing was underway, but it would take years, and in the meantime, people were being exposed. I couldn't let that part go. I contacted one of the environmental lawyers involved in the class action lawsuit against the development group. Her name was Diane Ruiz. She'd been working the case for months, trying to get compensation for the affected families. I told her I had the original data, Jacob Miller's research, the unaltered contamination levels. She said that would be critical. The defense was arguing that the contamination was naturally occurring, that the levels were within acceptable ranges. Jacob's data would prove otherwise. I sent her everything I had. Lab reports, field notes, the draft memo Jacob had written before he disappeared. Diane said it was exactly what she needed. She filed it with the court. The defense tried to challenge the chain of custody, but the FBI had documented everything. The evidence was solid. The lawsuit moved forward. More families joined. The scale of the contamination became public. Local news picked it up, then regional, then national. It became a story about corporate negligence, about regulatory capture, about what happens when profit is prioritized over safety. And at the center of it, quietly, was Jacob Miller's research, the work he died trying to protect. Diane called me after one of the hearings. She said the families wanted to meet me. They wanted to thank me for bringing the data forward. I didn't want to go. I didn't feel like I deserved thanks. I'd solved a murder case. I hadn't saved anyone. But Diane insisted. She said it mattered to them. So I went. The meeting was in a community center in one of the affected neighborhoods. About 30 people showed up. Parents, grandparents, a few older kids. They told me their stories. Health issues that had started after they moved in, unexplained illnesses, doctors who couldn't figure out what was wrong. And then the testing results. Elevated lead levels in children, kidney problems, respiratory issues. One woman, a mother of two, said she'd been told her son's developmental delays were genetic. But after the stool testing, they'd found lead contamination in their yard. The levels were 10 times higher than safe limits. She said if it hadn't been for Jacob's data, they never would have known. The company would have kept denying it. Her son would have kept getting sicker. She thanked me. Others did too. I didn't know what to say. I told them I was sorry. Sorry it had taken so long. Sorry Jacob hadn't lived to see his work used for something good. They understood. They said he was a hero, that his research had saved lives, even if he hadn't known it. I wanted to believe that, but all I could think about was the fact that Jacob had died alone, terrified, in a storage unit, that his death could have been prevented if someone had listened earlier. After the meeting, Diane and I talked. She said the lawsuit was going to settle. The development group couldn't fight the evidence. They were offering compensation, relocation assistance, medical monitoring for affected families. It wasn't enough. It never would be. But it was something. She asked what I was going to do next, if I was taking on new cases. I said I didn't know. I'd been doing this work for years. Cold cases, missing persons, unsolved deaths. It was exhausting. It was isolating. And lately, it felt like I was just documenting tragedies, not preventing them. Diane said I'd done more than that. She said I'd given people answers. Closure. Justice. I appreciated the sentiment, but I wasn't sure I believed it. I drove home that night thinking about Jacob, about who he'd been before he became a victim, before he became a case file. He'd been a graduate student, quiet, serious, someone who cared about doing the right thing. And that care had made him a target. I thought about the watch, the one engraved with his initials, the one he'd pawned when he was desperate, then redeemed because it mattered to him, the one Richard Holt had taken as a trophy. The watch was in evidence now. It would stay there until the appeals were exhausted. Then it would be released to Jacob's family. I hoped they'd keep it. I hoped it would mean something to them. But I also knew it was just an object, a piece of metal. It couldn't bring him back. nothing could. I spent the next few weeks trying to return to normal, whatever normal meant. I took on a few small cases, background checks, records requests, nothing intense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that there was still a piece of the Holt case I hadn't fully understood. It wasn't evidence. The case was closed. Holt was in prison. The murders were solved. It was something else, something about motive. Holt had said he was protecting the firm, protecting the money, but the firm's executives were facing criminal charges. They were cooperating with prosecutors, trying to minimize their sentences. And in their testimony, a pattern emerged. Holt hadn't just been an enforcer. He'd been a participant. He'd been the one suggesting the data alterations. He'd been the one identifying which employees were risks. He'd been the architect, not just the weapon. The executives had gone along with it because Holt made it easy. He handled the messy parts. He insulated them from consequences. But Holt had also been profiting. Shell companies, kickbacks, payments routed through offshore accounts. The FBI forensic accountants found millions. Money Holt had stashed over the years. Money he'd never spent, never touched. It was insurance, leverage, a way to ensure his silence was valuable. But when the case started unraveling, when I started connecting the pieces, Holt's leverage disappeared. The money became evidence. The shell companies became liabilities. He'd killed to protect his position, and when that position collapsed, he'd killed to protect himself. It was logical, cold, efficient. But there was something else in his final words to me, something personal. He'd said I'd made it personal, that I'd destroyed his carefully built life. He'd seen himself as a professional, someone who made hard decisions for practical reasons, someone who maintained control. And I'd stripped that away. I'd shown him for what he was, a murderer, a coward, someone who'd killed people to protect money. That was what had broken him, not the evidence, not the law enforcement pressure, the loss of his self-image. He'd needed to believe he was justified, that his actions were necessary, that he was the only one capable of doing what needed to be done. And when that belief shattered, he'd lashed out, desperate, violent, uncontrolled. Understanding that didn't change anything. It didn't make the case more or less solved, but it gave me a clearer picture of who Richard Holt had been. Not a criminal mastermind, not a calculating genius, just a man who'd convinced himself his cruelty was competence. I wrote up my final analysis, sent it to Agent Vinson. She thanked me, said it would be useful for the sentencing memorandum. Then she asked if I was doing okay. I told her I was fine. She didn't believe me. She said she'd worked enough cases to recognize when someone was struggling. She said I should talk to someone, a therapist, a counselor, someone trained in trauma. I said I'd think about it. I didn't. Instead, I started running. Every morning, before sunrise, miles through empty streets. It helped. Not with the memories, but with the restlessness. I needed to move, to exhaust myself, to occupy my body so my mind could rest. It worked, sometimes. Other times, I'd finish a run and stand in my apartment, breathing hard, still thinking about Jacob, about the moment he realized Holt had found him, about the fear he must have felt. I wondered if he'd fought, if he'd tried to run, if he'd had time to understand what was happening. The medical examiner's report said he'd been struck from behind, blunt force trauma, quick. He probably hadn't suffered long. That was supposed to be a comfort. It wasn't. Because Jacob had suffered for years, living under a stolen name, always looking over his shoulder, always afraid the past would catch up. And eventually, it had. 3 months after the trial, I got a call from Jacob's sister. I didn't know he had family until the case went public. She'd seen the news coverage. She'd reached out through the FBI. Her name was Emily. She lived on the West Coast. She said she hadn't spoken to Jacob in over a decade. They drifted apart after their parents died. Different lives, different priorities. She said she'd tried to find him a few times, but he'd never responded to messages, never updated his contact information. She'd assumed he wanted distance. She'd respected that. Now she knew why. She said she wished she'd tried harder, wished she'd pushed to stay connected. Maybe if she had, he would have felt safe enough to reach out when things went wrong. I told her it wasn't her fault. Jacob had been protecting her, keeping her away from the danger. She said that didn't make it easier. I understood. She asked if I'd meet her. She was flying in to collect Jacob's remains. She wanted to hear about the investigation, about who he'd been in those final years. I agreed. We met at a coffee shop near the airport. She looked like Jacob. Same eyes, same serious expression. She thanked me for solving the case, for giving her answers. I told her about Jacob's life as Aaron Fletcher, about Claire Dawson, the woman he'd dated, about the jobs he'd worked, the places he'd lived. I told her he'd been careful, that he'd tried to build a quiet life, that he'd almost succeeded. Emily listened. She cried quietly. She said it sounded lonely. It was. She asked about the watch. She said Jacob had gotten it when he'd finished his undergrad degree. A gift to himself, a symbol of his future. She said he'd been so proud of it. He'd worn it every day. I told her the watch was in evidence, but it would be released eventually. She could have it. She nodded. She said she'd like that. We talked for another hour about Jacob, about their childhood, about the person he'd been before fear had reshaped him. Emily said she was going to bury him under his real name, Jacob Raymond Miller. She said he deserved that. I agreed. Before she left, she gave me something, an old photo. Jacob, maybe 22 years old, standing in front of a university building, smiling, holding a diploma. She said she thought I should have it. She said Jacob had trusted me to tell the truth, to make sure people knew what had happened to him. I didn't feel like I deserved it, but I took it anyway. I kept that photo on my desk, a reminder, not of the case, of the person. Because that's what gets lost in investigations, the humanity, the individual, the life that existed before it became evidence. Jacob Miller had been a person. He'd had dreams, relationships, a future. And Richard Holt had taken all of that, not for survival, not for protection, for money, for convenience, for control. That was the part I couldn't reconcile. The banality of it, the smallness of the motive compared to the enormity of the crime. 4 people dead, dozens of families poisoned, years of fear and suffering. And for what? Corporate profit, clean reports, plausible deniability. It made me angry. Not the sharp, immediate anger of the investigation, but a slow, heavy anger that settled in and didn't leave. I started looking into other cases, other consulting firms, other environmental assessments that seemed too clean. I wasn't hired to do it. I wasn't getting paid. But I needed to know if this was isolated or systemic. It didn't take long to find patterns. Projects that moved too fast. Reports that glossed over red flags. Data that conveniently supported the client's desired outcome. Most of it was probably legitimate. Confirmation bias. Optimistic interpretation. Not fraud, just human nature. But some of it felt familiar. The same smoothness. The same lack of rough edges. I compiled what I found. I sent it to Diane Ruiz. She said she'd look into it. She said if there was another case, she'd file it. I told her to be careful, to watch for retaliation, to remember what had happened to Jacob. She said she would. But I wasn't sure that was enough. Because people like Richard Holt don't exist in isolation. They exist in systems that reward efficiency and punish whistleblowers. Systems that value profit over safety. Systems that make it easier to silence a problem than solve it. And until those systems change, there will always be another Richard Holt. Another Jacob Miller. Another case that starts with good intentions and ends in a storage unit. That realization was heavy, immobilizing, but it was also clarifying. I couldn't change the system alone. I couldn't prevent every tragedy, but I could keep doing the work, keep finding the truth, keep making sure the victims weren't forgotten. That was enough. It had to be. I went back to taking cases, missing persons, cold homicides, unresolved disappearances. Some I solved, some I didn't. But I kept looking, kept asking questions, kept pushing. Because that's what Jacob had tried to do. He'd seen something wrong. He'd tried to expose it. And even though it had cost him everything, his work had mattered. It had saved lives. It had brought justice. It had changed the conversation. That was his legacy. Not the fear, not the flight, the courage to document the truth, even when he knew how dangerous it was. I wanted to honor that, to carry it forward. So I kept working. And every time I closed a case, every time I found an answer, I thought about Jacob, about the watch, about the quiet determination it took to keep going when everything was against you. That's what this work is. Not heroism, not genius, just persistence. The refusal to stop asking questions. The willingness to see what others ignore. Richard Holt had tried to bury the truth. He'd succeeded for years. But eventually, the truth surfaced. Because someone kept digging. That someone was Jacob. And then it was me. And now it's whoever picks up the next case. The next lead. The next buried file. The work doesn't end. It just continues. One case at a time. One answer at a time. And that's how justice happens. Not in courtrooms. Not in headlines. In the quiet, relentless effort to uncover what was hidden. To name what was ignored. To remember what was forgotten. Jacob Miller is remembered now. His name is on court documents, on environmental reports, on memorials in the neighborhoods his research helped protect. He didn't get to see it, but it happened. And that has to be enough. Because in this work, closure is rare. Justice is incomplete. Victory is partial. But the truth, once found, is permanent. And the truth is this: Jacob Raymond Miller was a whistleblower who died trying to protect people he'd never met. Richard, aged 6 months after the trial, I received a package. No return address. Postmarked from a small town I'd never heard of. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. The note was brief. "You should see this. It connects to your case. Be careful." No signature. No explanation. I plugged the drive into my laptop. It contained a single folder. Inside were scanned documents, environmental reports, soil samples, lab results. The dates went back 15 years. The locations were spread across 4 states. Different consulting firms, different development companies, but the pattern was identical to what I'd found in Jacob's case. Contamination levels minimized, data altered, clean reports issued for sites that should have failed inspection. And in the margins of several documents, handwritten notes, initials, comments, corrections that had never made it into the final versions. One set of initials appeared repeatedly: RH, Richard Holt. He'd been doing this longer than I'd realized, longer than the investigation had uncovered. The 4 murders were just the visible tip. There were likely more people who'd asked questions, more threads that had been eliminated. I spent days going through the documents, cross-referencing names, locations, dates, building a timeline that stretched back over a decade. Some of the projects I recognized from the original investigation. Others were new, sites that had never been flagged, developments that had been built and sold without anyone raising concerns. I contacted Agent Vincent. I told her what I'd found. She said she'd loop in the task force. They'd need to verify the documents, trace their origin, determine if they were admissible. But she also said something else. She said I needed to be careful. Whoever sent me that drive knew details that weren't public, knew I'd worked the case, knew how to find me. That meant someone was still out there, someone with access to records that should have been sealed or destroyed, someone who wanted this information exposed, but didn't want to do it themselves. A whistleblower, just like Jacob. I started looking for them. I analyzed the postmark, researched the town, pulled property records and employment databases, tried to identify anyone connected to the consulting firms or development companies who might have reason to come forward now. It was slow work. The town was small, quiet, no obvious connections to any of the companies involved. But then I found something. A recent obituary. A man named Gerald Finch, former project manager at one of the consulting firms. He died 3 weeks earlier. Natural causes. Heart attack. The obituary mentioned he was survived by a daughter, no name given, just his beloved daughter. I dug deeper, found her name in property records. Angela Finch. She'd moved to the town where the package was postmarked. She'd moved there 2 months before her father died. I tried calling. No answer. I left a voicemail. Said I was a researcher. Said I'd received some documents that might be connected to her father's work. Said I wanted to talk. She called back the next day. Her voice was cautious. She asked what documents I was talking about. I described them generally: environmental reports, historical projects, data integrity issues. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, her father had kept files, personal copies of projects he'd worked on. He'd told her to hold on to them, to make sure they didn't disappear. She said he'd been scared in his final years, paranoid. He'd talked about people who'd vanished, colleagues who'd left suddenly. He'd said he knew too much, that he'd seen things he wasn't supposed to. She said after he died, she'd gone through his papers. She'd found the files. She'd recognized some of the names, including Richard Holt. She'd followed the trial. She'd read the coverage. She'd realized her father had been part of the same system, that he'd known what was happening and had stayed silent. She said she couldn't live with that, so she'd sent the files to me, because I'd exposed Holt, because I'd made sure the truth came out. I asked if her father had ever mentioned being threatened, if he'd felt like he was in danger. She said yes. He'd mentioned someone watching his house, calls that hung up when he answered. He'd thought it was paranoia, but now she wasn't sure. I asked if he'd ever talked about Richard Holt specifically. She hesitated. Then she said her father had mentioned Holt once. Years ago. He'd said Holt was the kind of person who made problems disappear. That management loved him for it, but that working with him felt dangerous. Her father had transferred to a different division shortly after, moved to a different state, trying to distance himself. But he'd kept the files, as insurance or as evidence. She wasn't sure which. I thanked her. I told her she'd done the right thing. I told her the information would be investigated. She asked if her father would be implicated, if his name would be tied to the fraud. I said I didn't know. I said the prosecutors would make that determination. But I told her that coming forward now, even posthumously, mattered. It showed accountability. It showed he'd wanted the truth to surface, even if he hadn't been able to do it himself. She said she hoped that was true. We ended the call. I sat with the files for hours, building case summaries, drafting timelines, preparing the material for the federal task force. The scope was staggering. Dozens of projects, hundreds of falsified data points, potentially thousands of people affected. And Richard Holt had been at the center of it, not just a participant, a coordinator, someone who'd built relationships across firms and ensured that the right people stayed quiet and the wrong people disappeared. The task force took the files seriously. They launched a broader investigation, subpoenaed records from multiple firms, interviewed former employees who'd left under suspicious circumstances. Some cooperated, others lawyered up. A few disappeared before they could be contacted. The investigation expanded, federal, multi-state. It became one of the largest environmental fraud cases in decades. And at the heart of it, still, was Jacob Miller's original research. The data that had started everything. The truth he died trying to protect. His name appeared in every filing, every report, every court document. He'd become a symbol, a reminder of what happens when people try to do the right thing in systems designed to punish them for it. Emily called me during this period. She said she'd been following the news. She said it was overwhelming. She thought Jacob's case was isolated. Now she realized how much bigger it was. She asked if I thought Jacob had known, if he'd understood the full scale of what he'd uncovered. I said I thought he'd suspected. That's why he'd kept copies of everything. That's why he'd run. He'd known he was exposing something larger than a single site. Something that would put him in direct conflict with people who had resources and reach. Emily said she wished he'd had someone to help him, someone to share the burden. I said I did too. She asked what would happen next, if more arrests were coming, if more families would get justice. I told her the truth. I said it would take years, that some people would avoid accountability, that some victims would never be identified. But I also said that Jacob's work had created momentum, that it had forced a reckoning, that the system he'd exposed was being dismantled, slowly, piece by piece. She said she hoped he'd be proud of that. I said I thought he would be. After we hung up, I sat at my desk. The photo she'd given me was still there. Jacob, young, smiling, holding his diploma. I thought about the path his life had taken, from that moment of hope and accomplishment to a storage unit, from a promising future to a stolen identity and a shallow grave. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But his death hadn't been meaningless. His work had survived. His courage had inspired others. Gerald Finch's daughter had come forward because of Jacob. Other whistleblowers were stepping up because of the precedent his case had set. The truth was spreading, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. That was Jacob's real legacy, not the tragedy, the ripple effect, the way his choice to document the truth had created space for others to do the same. I started getting calls from journalists. They wanted to interview me about the case, about the investigation, about what it meant for corporate accountability. I did a few interviews. I tried to keep the focus on Jacob, on the victims, on the systemic failures that had allowed this to happen. But the journalists wanted a narrative, a hero, a villain, a tidy resolution. I told them it wasn't that simple. I told them Richard Holt was one person in a much larger machine, that he'd been enabled by executives who'd looked the other way, by regulators who'd accepted reports without scrutiny, by a system that rewarded efficiency over accuracy. Some of them got it. Others just wanted a headline. I stopped doing interviews after a while. It felt performative, extractive, like the story was being reduced to entertainment instead of treated as a warning. But the work continued. The task force kept building cases. More indictments came down. More settlements were reached. And I kept taking on new cases, because the work didn't stop just because one investigation concluded. There were always more missing persons, more cold cases, more families waiting for answers. I took on a case about a woman who disappeared from a hiking trail. Another about a man who'd vanished after reporting safety violations at his workplace. Another about a teenager who'd gone missing after witnessing something she shouldn't have. Each case was different. Each had its own complexities, its own dead ends, its own moments of revelation. But they all had one thing in common. Someone had been erased, and someone needed to bring them back. That was my job. That was my purpose. Not to be a hero, not to get recognition, just to keep looking, keep asking, keep refusing to let people disappear without consequence. It was exhausting. It was isolating. But it was also necessary. Because if people like me didn't do this work, who would? The system wasn't designed to care about the missing, the forgotten, the inconvenient. It was designed to move on, to close files, to declare cases unsolvable and allocate resources elsewhere. But I couldn't move on. Not when I knew what it felt like to find the truth, to give a family closure, to prove that someone's life had mattered. That feeling kept me going, even on the hard days, even when cases went cold, even when I wanted to quit. I thought about Jacob often, about the choice he'd made to keep copies of the data, to hold on to the evidence even when it put him in danger. He'd known he might not survive, but he'd done it anyway, because he'd believed the truth mattered more than his safety. That kind of courage was rare, and it deserved to be honored, not with awards or ceremonies, but with action, with the commitment to keep fighting for the truth, no matter the cost. I tried to live up to that. I didn't always succeed, but I tried. And slowly over time, I started to feel like I was doing more than just documenting tragedies. I was contributing to something larger, a network of investigators, journalists, lawyers, and activists who refused to let injustice go unanswered. We didn't always win. We didn't always get justice, but we kept showing up, kept pushing, kept making it harder for people like Richard Holt to operate in the shadows. That was enough. It had to be. Because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant more victims, more cover-ups, more families left without answers. I couldn't accept that. So I kept working, kept searching, kept honoring the memory of Jacob Miller and everyone else who tried to do the right thing and paid the price for it. Their stories wouldn't be forgotten, not while I was still looking, not while there was still work to be done. The rain kept falling outside my window, steady, constant. The same rain that had been falling the night I started this case. The same rain that would keep falling long after I finished. But inside, in the quiet of my apartment, I had my files, my notes, my recordings. I had the truth. And as long as I had that, I had a reason to keep going. One case at a time, one answer at a time, one step closer to justice. That was the work. That was the mission. And I wasn't done yet.